Learn to draw natural and realistic looking eyes in 20 minutes. Hi, I'm AnnHelen. Join me as I show you how to block in the forms of the eye, how to determine the light source and the shadow forms, and how to use shading to achieve the value contrast you need. Plus, you'll learn tips on how to master your drawing skills.
The eye is shaped like a ball, but it's mostly covered by the flesh and skin in the eye socket. The shape of the eye can change greatly according to the angle of the head and face, the direction of the eye's gaze, the direction of the light source, and the strength of the light source. Also, the expressions of feelings and emotions, and of course, the particular eye characteristics of that person you're drawing. It is a good idea to draw the eye in the context of the eye socket. So I draw a horizontal line and a vertical line to establish the relative position of the eye in the eye socket. Here's a nose bridge and then the eyebrows. First, I block in the shape of the eye with straight lines. 3 straight lines for the top. Now to the outer edge of the eye, which is slightly higher than that of the inner edge, inner corner. And now 3 lines for the bottom lid. Then I draw smaller straight lines between where the larger straight lines come together to soften the angles that the larger lines create. And in doing so, I'm starting to have a more curved shape for this part or the overall shape of the eye. This is one of the best used secrets from master artists. They block in forms using straight lines first. Next, I want to draw in the basic eye structure. This is the upper lid, which should connect from the inner corner of the eye on the left to the outer corner of the eye. I'm still drawing very softly because the lids are rather small parts of the eye, and unless you are drawing a person wearing very heavy eyeliner in the inner lids, these parts are relatively light in color. The face and the eye are looking toward the viewer, so the iris will be around the center of the eye. The iris is about half as wide as the eye. So I draw a rough circle to make sure that the iris is not too big or too small. Part of the iris is covered in the eye socket by the upper lid. I draw 2 short horizontal and vertical lines to indicate where the middle of the iris is. Where these 2 lines intersect will help me draw the pupil in the eye later. I want to mark where the bottom part of the iris touches the lower lid. It may be sometimes covered by the lower lid. I'm adjusting the size of the iris because I believe I drew it too large. And you should do the same. Don't be afraid of making adjustments to your drawing, especially in the beginning part, when it's easier to remove any mistakes you have with an eraser. And also you want to constantly be making adjustments throughout the drawing. And this is another secret for mastering your drawing skills. At every stage of your drawing, you want to be constantly looking at your reference photo, or in this case, even with no reference photo, I want to make sure that all my forms are good before I start filling in or start making, drawing in the shadows. I don't know how long you've been drawing, but everybody starts somewhere, and I believe drawing involves skills that are acquired. So this really means that anybody can start at any time. And doesn't matter where you are, you may not be able to draw like I do right now, but eventually I believe you can. Okay, back to the drawing. I'm drawing the crease on top of the eye in 3 main strokes. The crease above the upper lid is a common feature of the eye for many people in the world, although the thickness of it, the length of it, and even the shape of it may be a little different. Okay, I'm redrawing part of the lid that was erased earlier. Okay, I'm redrawing the iris again. Once again, I didn't like it that it was too big. I'm redefining the inner corner and the tear duct area of the eye. I haven't done much with the eyebrow because I just want to know its relative position to the eye so that I have something to use for the later part of this drawing. Before I start shading the eye, I need to decide where the light and shadows are gonna be. Under normal lighting conditions, the light is from the top, and the eye socket itself is one of the darkest areas on the face. For realistic looking portrait or eye, it is a good idea that the light is not coming from all directions because there will be no sense of shadow and form. But you want the light to be coming from one or even at most two strong light sources. So the light's coming from the top and slightly to the right of this face. I've been drawing the upper lid and crease of the eye with slightly more pressure, making darker marks. At this angle, the upper lid looks like it extends beyond the outer edge of the lower lid, so I drew it a little longer. I'm also slightly shading the areas of this eye socket that is turned away from the source of the light. This is called the form shadow because the form or the shape or direction of the curve of the flesh itself or the skin itself is turned away from the source of light. Although it's not a real shadow, it can get pretty dark because the skin is turned in a curve. And where it turns away from the light the most, that part will get dark. Okay, I'm getting to the fun part of the eye. I am using the cross that I drew earlier to mark where the pupil is. I just marked it very small. And I want to define some of the brightest reflection area of the eye. I know I can use some markers later, white markers later, but I don't want to do that. I prefer to outline and draw in the forms of the lightest area so that I will not draw over them later by accident. The lights reflected in the iris are usually the brightest or the lightest part of the eye, and they come in different shapes and even sizes. When I blocked out the shapes of these bright spots or reflections, I just shaded the rest of the iris in a light coat of gray. Now pay attention to the way I hold my pencil from a darker drawing to a lighter shading. To shade lightly, I hold the pencil much further away from the tip of the pencil and I apply much less pressure. And although you probably can't see it from this angle, my pencil is much more slanted, meaning it's actually closer to the surface of the paper than when I'm drawing more dark. So even with the B graphite pencil, I can go from very dark to very light by applying different pressure. You may be wondering why I am shading inside the white part of the eye. Well, the fact is, the white of the eye is actually not white in color. The white of the eye appears to be a very light pink to even a grayish blue color. If you look at a black and white photo of the eye, you will notice that the white of the eye is slightly darker than the brightest spots on the iris of the eye. The upper eyelid also casts some shadow on the white of the eye. So the overall result is that the white of the eye, wherever it's turned away from the light, will have some kind of form shadow. And the part of the eye that is covered by the upper eyelid will have some kind of cast shadow. I've been using various hand pressure to shade within the white of the eye to create this illusion of a rounded form. So even inside the inside corner of the eye is not very light. In fact, it's usually a flesh or pink or reddish color with some highlights in it. There's usually a small rounded area under the lower eyelid. I think sometimes it's called the eye bag, but it can be much smaller than an eye bag. It's an area that is also curved, and when it curves downward and turns away from the light, and in this case, the lower left corner also receives some form shadow. The area of the eye in the eye socket that is closest to the nose bridge often is set pretty inward and has quite a bit of form shadow. Under normal light conditions, this is one of the darkest area for the eye socket. But I don't want to shade it too dark right now because I have not actually shaded in the darkest part of the eye yet. I'm shading in a skin color that is still slightly darker than the white of the eye that has been shaded. Because the light is coming from the top and the upper eyelid faces downward, the upper eyelid will have both form and cast shadows. This also means that under most normal light conditions, the upper eyelid and the cast shadow area underneath it are some of the darkest areas of an eye. Another area that's usually the darkest of an eye is the pupil. If you like this tutorial so far, please click the thumbs up button. Your support will help me to create more drawing or art tutorials like this. And feel free to leave comments or any suggestions for my future tutorials. To draw in the darker values of the eye, I switched to my 4B mechanical pencil a while back. From this point on, you will see me switch very quickly between my B pencil and the 4B mechanical pencil. When I use a 4B pencil at the skin tone areas, I try to be very careful and again use very little pressure because it can get very dark very quickly if I'm not careful. At this stage of the drawing, I believe the most important thing is to figure out the correct relationship between the light and the shadow, namely the values and how dark and how light the different parts of the eye are. I'm starting to shade in the iris area because the other parts of the eye are mostly established and not likely to change. To create a sense of depth, volume, and three-dimensionality, I started shading the iris in different ways. I shaded a strip of darker values across the iris from its top left to its lower right corner, while leaving what's left side of it fairly light. Under normal light conditions, the pupil is usually larger than what you see here. I made it a little smaller here because I can always enlarge it later. Also, the outer edges of the iris is usually darker than the white of the eye. For eyes with lighter iris colors such as green, blue, or hazel, you may see patterns like rays or sunbursts coming out of the pupil. These rays or projections are not uniform in length or shape, so I'm drawing them very organically, meaning that I don't draw them all the same. I try to draw them with slightly different widths, lengths, and shapes. The areas of the rays that are closest to the pupil are usually darker. I'm not using any reference photos for this tutorial, so I can draw these rays as dark or as lightly as I want to. If you're drawing with a reference photo, just remember that for lighter iris colors, The darkest part of the iris is still the pupil. If you want to make an eye look realistic, the key is not how many details you put in. So even now, I don't want to be distracted by drawing all the details. So what are the keys to drawing realistic eyes? First, the shapes that make up the different parts of the eye must look believable. Secondly, the values you use to portray the forms and the shadows of the eye must also be believable. Having a wide range of values or having a wide range of the darkest and the lightest parts is very essential for the creation of realism and also to keep your drawing from looking flat. My focus is on keeping or increasing the value contrast. So I'm making the darkest areas of my drawing even darker. By doing so, I'm making the lighter areas pop. I am gradually increasing the darker areas layer by layer. So even in the sped up video, it may seem that it will take a long time for you to build up the value differences. You can build up the value contrast between the dark and light areas more quickly if you were to shade the darker areas darker than what you see right now. But you do risk making mistakes while shading too dark too quickly. And then you will have to erase your mistakes and then go back and redraw the areas that you just did. So the safer and actually more efficient way of building up your values is to start with a lighter layer and then gradually go darker. I draw eyebrows towards the end of this drawing tutorial because eyebrows usually play a more supporting role. They're usually not the main character of the eye. First, I draw short, simple strokes across the whole eyebrow. This is more to block in the shape and indicate the overall color of the brow. And then I go back with increased pressure to indicate certain darker parts. You don't want to draw every strand of hair in the eyebrow, but just indicate the color and the direction of these strands of hair. Where you draw the strands, you want to make sure that the strands are not just parallel to each other, but that they can go in a general direction but vary the angle slightly. Try to have a variety of value and direction of the hair in the eyebrow. I'm putting in some finishing touches on the eye, and this is when I am ready to draw some eyelashes. I never spend a lot of time on the eyelashes because they're more like the icing on the cake. As a general rule, you don't want to draw every eyelash on the eye. For this tutorial, I'm drawing more eyelashes than usual so you can see how I draw them and the direction where they should be drawn in. Draw the eyelashes using short, curved lines and not straight lines. Start them from the outer edge of the upper and lower eyelids. Try to vary the spacing between the eyelashes. Eyelashes can also come in clumps of 2 or 3, and they do tend to overlap each other as well. At this angle of the face, the eyelashes towards the outer corner of the eyelids are usually longer than those towards the inside. I continue to build on the contrast between the lighter and darker areas. I want to make sure that I indicate that under these eyelashes there is a darker cast shadow area in the white of the eye. I'm also tweaking some of the details of the eyelashes. Want to make sure that I have a variety of strands type and maybe slight directions and spacing. I use my kneaded eraser to remove some pencil marks because I want to indicate the small bump at the inner corner of the eye between the inner corner of the eye and the nose bridge. If you like to learn how to use blending on your graphite sketches, especially for the skin tones, it's coming up in the next section. However, I'd like to add that I don't usually use blending on my graphite sketches. The first reason is since I shade so lightly and I use slow, gradual process of building up the layers, there's no need for me to blend. Also, the blending process will remove quite a few of the pencil marks that I already drew. So after blending, I will have to go back and redraw some of the marks that I already made. I'm going to stop talking for the rest of this video, but please observe how I am drawing.